Why did this movie flop? How do bad movies happen to good people? How can a billion-dollar business place such sloppy bets? Summer 2013 is, still to this day, the best box office summer ever. But in the midst of all that success, there was a flop called R.I.P.D. It was greenlit at the height of the comic book movie craze. A strange plot, but a strong cast. During production, the budget ballooned to a reported 130 mil, so probably closer to 195 mil. It premiered with 12, beaten by a cheap horror movie and an animated kids movie about snails. What in God's name is going on here? These are some of the worst numbers I've ever seen in my life. Wouldn't a multi-billion-dollar industry know how to place stronger bets? Absolutely not. Let's get into it. Our timeline starts in 2010. Variety announces that Universal is officially greenlighting R.I.P.D, an adaptation of a little-known comic book miniseries. Ryan Reynolds is circling the lead role, but he's incredibly busy. He's hoping for a quick shoot that he can sandwich between his many other projects. But there is a catch. Reynolds' film Green Lantern is about to release, and if it proves successful, Warner Brothers will fast-track the sequel, and Reynolds is bound by contract to return. Therefore, Universal can only have him for R.I.P.D. if they entertain the possibility of delaying the entire production for him. February 2011, Zach Galifianakis is in negotiations to co-star with Reynolds, but he is also very busy. And after a few months, Galifianakis drops out. The uncertainty of the production timeline threatens to conflict with his other commitments. Not long after this, Jeff Bridges signs on to replace him. By all accounts, the production goes well, and filming wraps on January 27th of 2012. During the last little stretch of post-production, Universal tells the director that he has to convert the film to 3D in just 4 months. The release date is set for July 19th of 2013. The writing was on the wall for R.I.P.D. In its opening weekend, it was crushed by all of its competition. It opened at number 7, then fell to number 9, then went to 13, spending just 2 weekends in the top 10 at all. And even if we take the studio at their word and we say the budget was 130, these are still some of the worst numbers I've ever seen in my entire life. What happened here? Now that we have all the facts, let's proceed into our findings. And number 1, R.I.P.D. is a terrible title, both written and spoken. Phonetics play a part in marketability, and the source material had no sizable fan base. R.I.P.D. was decidedly not a pre-existing pop culture phenomenon, and so an ugly title is going to make it a much harder sell. Keeping the name R.I.P.D. was a terrible marketing decision. Something safer and more bland, like Undead Police, would have been much more palatable. Also worthy of note, look at the big revolvers, look at Jeff Bridges' entire character. This movie had a bit of a Western vibe, and for whatever reason, this is box office poison in the modern movie landscape, with very few exceptions. And I can't help but believe that if Galifianakis were there, playing kind of like a cheesy comedy version of that character, it might have sat better with audiences. For the next factor, I will admit that this film may have flopped in part due to its actual quality. You know, I make these long-ass videos about big flops, and someone always comments without fail, "It flopped because it was bad," which is false. That's a lot like saying marketing doesn't work on me. It's false. Good shit makes bad money, and bad shit makes good money all the time. But sometimes, the trick doesn't work, and the audience can smell a bad movie before they buy the ticket. And that may have been the case here. But there is almost always more to it than that. Here's the main reason why this flopped, alright? This entire case reeks of a midstream strategy shift by the studio. Recall that Galifianakis was supposed to be in the Bridges role. Consider that Ryan Reynolds, one of the busiest men in Hollywood, thought he could bang this out between a dozen other projects. This was meant to be a quick comedy shoot, and somehow became a $200 million tentpole, packed with expensive CGI. This was the early 2010s, alright? Avatar had just come out. Avatar was not based on a pre-existing thing. It wasn't a remake, it wasn't a comic book adaptation. Avatar was an original intellectual property, and it became the highest grossing movie of all time. And then just a few years later, Avengers took the title. A pre-existing thing, but an interconnected series of movies planned years in advance that then culminated in an expensive crescendo that was handed off to an auteur. You have to understand, to a conference room full of soulless ghouls, this is horrifying. This is the worst case scenario. And for around this time, studio executives had no idea what to do next. 2 months after R.I.P.D. came and went, Jeff Bridges did an interview with GQ. He remarks that while he had a lot of fun on the set, the studio made some choices that he would not have made. A few months after that, in a Reddit AMA, he says that R.I.P.D. was his chance at a comedy, and that he had a wonderful time making it. The studio cut it against the grain and really screwed up the editing of the movie. R.I.P.D. started out life as a cheap Men in Black style comedy. It had a nice little safety net of being able to say based on the graphic novel. But at some point, Universal saw that and thought it could inflate the project into something different, midstream, something a little more significant to their summer slate. They tried to Frankenstein it into a tentpole and it blew up in their faces. And they would make the same mistake again tomorrow, because that's what this kind of company does. Mob mentality is the idea that in a large group, in a mob, the mob takes on the IQ of its lowest IQ member. It's exactly what a studio is. Art, good entertainment even, happens in spite of the studio executive 99% of the time. In this case is a perfect little textbook example of the mistakes they make and of the lessons they are not willing to learn. But in case they start, I'll be here, cataloging every single one. Case closed.